My father leaned in close enough that I could catch the heavy, expensive scent of his mahogany-infused cologne, and he whispered a question that cut through the air as sharp and jagged as a serrated blade, demanding, "Why are you even showing your face here today?" He chose to say those stinging, dismissive words inside the sacred, quiet sanctuary of the stone chapel exactly 10 minutes before my younger sister, Isabella, was set to begin her long walk down the aisle to get married. The room was drowning in thick, opulent arrangements of white roses and lilies, and the soft, melodic strains of a string quartet filled the vaulted ceiling, while a room full of the town's social elite did their absolute best to look anywhere but at us, pretending they hadn't heard the cold dismissal of a father to his eldest child. I was already in the process of turning my body around to slip away, my hand reaching out for the heavy iron handle of the side door, when I noticed the groom's complexion go from a healthy, nervous tan to a ghostly, battlefield gray. It was not the kind of gray associated with typical wedding day jitters or simple stage fright. It was a deep, soul-shaking pallor that comes only when a man realizes he is standing in the presence of someone he never expected to see in a place like this. Benjamin rushed over to his father, who was seated in the very front pew in his formal attire, and leaned down to whisper with a voice that was barely audible but pulsed with a terrifying urgency, "Dad, look toward the back. It is actually her." The older man did not just turn his head. He stood up with a suddenness that made the people sitting around him jump in their seats, snapped his spine into a rigid posture of full military attention, and saluted me with a crisp precision that made the rest of the crowded, flower-scented room simply vanish into the background. The first thing I truly registered in that moment was the sudden, absolute quiet that descended over the chapel. And it wasn't the peaceful, reverent kind of silence you expect in a house of worship, but the heavy, pressurized kind of stillness that comes right before a structural beam finally snaps under too much weight. The entire chapel smelled of the hundreds of fresh, fragrant white lilies that had been placed on every available surface, mixed with the deep, earthy aroma of old wood polish that had been rubbed into the pews over the course of a century. Sunlight fell through the tall, stained-glass windows in pale, shimmering stripes of amber and blue, and I watched individual motes of dust floating through the air, looking slow and harmless as they moved through the light, as if they didn't have any idea of the social explosion that was about to occur. The string quartet, which had been softly warming up with a peace by, had stopped playing entirely, their bows hovering over the strings as they watched the scene unfold with wide eyes. Someone in the middle of the room let out a short, nervous cough, and then immediately looked down at their lap, appearing to think better of making any noise at all. I remained standing near the very back of the chapel, my dark coat folded neatly over my arm to hide my posture, and I felt the small, rectangular wedding card pressed flat against the palm of my hand. I had not actually planned to stay for the duration of the ceremony or the following reception at the country club. I had spent the entire morning telling myself that very thing, while I was getting ready in the small, cluttered guest room at my aunt's house on the outskirts of Charleston, South Carolina. I had rehearsed my presence today like a tactical extraction plan. Show up at the chapel, sit quietly in the shadows where no one would notice me, hand my sister the card and a small gift, smile for exactly 30 seconds if she saw me, and then vanish through the side exit before my own emotions could turn into unnecessary noise. I felt this way because today wasn't supposed to be about me or my career, and because my father had made it very clear many years ago that I was never supposed to be the center of attention in any room he occupied. I had chosen to wear a very simple, dark navy dress for the occasion, intentionally leaving my medals and my dress uniform in my luggage, so that I wouldn't draw even a single second look from the town's socialites. My hair was pulled back into a tight, professional bun, the way it always is when I feel my mind starting to race, and I need my thoughts to stay in a disciplined line. While I was looking in the mirror earlier that morning, I had repeated the same words to myself that my mother used to whisper to me whenever my father was in one of his dark, commanding moods. You must always be bigger than the room you are standing in. That had been my entire plan for the day, to be big enough to handle the rejection, but quiet enough to be forgotten. Then, despite my best efforts to remain anonymous, my father saw me. He had been standing near the very first pew, laughing a little too loudly at some joke, shaking hands with local politicians like a man running for a third term in office. He looked undeniably good for his age, with distinguished gray at his temples and a tailored suit that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments, maintaining the posture of someone who truly enjoyed being seen as the most important man in the county. He was completely in his element as the father of the bride, the master of ceremonies, and the storyteller-in-chief of Charleston society. His smile didn't just fade when his eyes landed on me, it froze solid, as if the temperature in the room had suddenly dropped below zero. He excused himself from the group of men he was charming and walked toward me, each step measured and controlled, the way he used to walk when I was a child, and I had done something to disappoint him. When he finally stopped in front of me, he didn't raise his voice, but the venom was unmistakable. "Why are you even here?" he asked, his lips barely moving as he tried to maintain the appearance of a pleasant conversation for the sake of the guests. "This is your sister's big day. Please, for once in your life, don't make things awkward for the family." Those words hit me harder than they should have, mostly because of how calmly and casually he delivered them, as if my very existence was a social burden he was tired of carrying. I felt that familiar, cold tightening just under my ribs, the physical sensation that always comes right before my old instincts and years of training kick in to take over. I told myself to breathe, to scan the environment, and to decide on the best course of action without letting my face betray a single flicker of hurt. Years of high-stakes training and being responsible for the lives of others don't just leave your system because you've traded your boots for a pair of heels and come back to your. "I am simply here to congratulate my sister on her marriage," I said, making sure my voice stayed as steady and level as a horizon line. "I'll be out of your way before you even notice I was here, Dad." He didn't look at me with affection. Instead, he looked right past me, checking the rows of pews to see who might be watching our interaction and whether or not his reputation was at risk. "Good," he said, his voice flat and dismissive. "Because you need to remember that this isn't about you." It never was. I gave him a single, sharp nod of my head, which was all the confirmation he needed to feel like he had successfully managed the situation. He turned his back on me and walked toward the front of the chapel, as if our conversation had been nothing more than a minor scheduling note he had to clear off his desk. I took one slow step toward the center aisle, intending to find a seat in the back, and then another toward the side door as the weight of the card in my hand felt heavier than it had a few minutes ago. I told myself that his words didn't matter, and I told myself that I was perfectly fine with being the invisible daughter. That was the moment I locked eyes with the groom. Benjamin was standing at the altar with his groomsmen, nervously adjusting his gold cufflinks and laughing a bit too fast at something his best man had said. According to the letters my sister had sent me, he had been relaxed and happy all morning, but when his eyes finally met mine across the length of the chapel, something visible drained out of his face. He went completely still, his expression not one of confusion or idle curiosity, but of profound, shocking recognition. His smile didn't just fade, it collapsed entirely. His hand froze halfway to his sleeve, paralyzed by the sight of me standing there in my simple navy dress. One of his groomsmen leaned in to say something to him, but Benjamin didn't even acknowledge the man. He turned sharply and began to move down the aisle with a purpose that startled the wedding photographer, heading straight for the front pew where his father sat. General Arthur Vance sat where he had been all morning, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his back as straight as a flagpole and his eyes fixed forward. He was wearing a dark, expensive civilian suit, but even without the 4 stars on his shoulders, there was no hiding what he was to anyone who knew how to look. Some men carry their rank and their history in their very marrow, and it shows in the way they occupy a chair and the way they command a room without saying a word. Benjamin leaned down, his mouth inches from his father's ear, and whispered, "Dad, it's her, it's really her." The general didn't react with surprise at first. He was a man who had seen too much of the world to be easily startled. Then he slowly turned his head to look over his shoulder. His eyes scanned the room until they found me standing near the lilies at the back, and in that instant, the entire atmosphere of the wedding changed. The general stood up, and he didn't do it slowly or with the careful movements of an older man. He rose with the power and speed of a man whose body recognizes a command from deep within. The sound of his movements caused the chairs in the front pews to shift, and a ripple of movement followed him as guests turned to see what had prompted such a reaction from a man of his stature. He took a second to straighten the lapels of his jacket, and then, right there in the middle of my sister's perfectly planned Charleston wedding, he came to a position of full military attention. The room went so quiet that I could hear the faint whistle of the air conditioning and the sound of my own rhythmic breathing. He saluted me. It was a clean, sharp, and perfectly executed salute, the kind that spoke of decades of discipline and mutual respect. "Ma'am," he said, his voice clear and resonant, carrying just far enough to reach every corner of the stone chapel. "It is a profound honor to finally stand in your presence." I didn't move an inch, and I didn't let a smile touch my face. I simply returned the salute with the same level of precision, my muscle memory guiding my arm through the familiar motion without me having to give it a single conscious thought. When my hand finally dropped back to my side, the silence in the room stretched out, becoming something thick and heavy. I looked at my father then, and I saw that his face had gone a terrifying shade of pale, the color leaching out of his skin as if someone had physically pulled a plug. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out, and he took a sharp breath as if he couldn't quite get enough oxygen into his lungs. The guests weren't staring at the general anymore. They were all staring at me, the quiet daughter who had been dismissed just moments ago. I wanted nothing more than to disappear into the shadows, not because of any sense of shame, but because I knew this wasn't how the day was supposed to go. I hadn't come here to be seen, and I certainly hadn't come here to be recognized for my service by a 4-star general in front of my entire. I had come because Isabella had begged me to be there, because I knew my mother would have wanted the family to be whole for at least 1 hour, and because I believe that some promises don't expire just because they have become inconvenient. The general lowered his hand and gave me a small, respectful nod, as if for a few seconds we were the only 2 people in the entire world. "Please forgive the brief interruption to the proceedings," he said to no one in particular, though his eyes stayed on mine. But respect is never out of place, regardless of the setting. My father actually swayed on his feet, looking like he might collapse. One of his business associates reached out a hand, unsure whether he should steady the man or step away from the social fallout. I felt the air in my own chest shift, feeling not lighter, but as if it were finally returning to its proper place. As the music from the string quartet started up again, sounding hesitant and a bit out of tune, I understood something that I had spent the last decade trying to avoid. I had never actually needed my father to see me or to validate the life I had built for myself. But I was officially done letting him be the one who decided whether or not I mattered. The music carried on, sounding thinner and more fragile than it had before, as if the musicians themselves were afraid of making another mistake in a room that had been rearranged. The guests settled back into their pews with the careful, ginger movements of people who had just witnessed a miracle or a car crash and weren't sure which one it was yet. The photographer lifted his expensive camera, then lowered it again, appearing completely unsure of where he should point the lens now that the social hierarchy of the room had been turned upside down. I slid into a seat near the aisle, my hands folded tightly in my lap and my eyes fixed forward. My heart was steady, perhaps a little too steady for the situation. That is something that happens sometimes after a moment of extreme tension passes. Once the body decides the immediate danger has faded, it switches into a quiet, hyper-focused mode that feels almost surreal. From the corner of my eye, I could see my father sink back onto the cushioned pew. His shoulders were stiff and unyielding, and his jaw was locked tight, as if he were trying to hold his entire world in place with his teeth. He didn't turn his head to look at me. He stared straight ahead at the altar, as if the sheer force of his attention could burn the memory of the last 2 minutes away. I decided to let him have that illusion for as long as he needed it. As the officiant finally cleared his throat and prepared to begin the ceremony again, my mind slipped backward in time, the way it always does when I am forced to sit still in a place that used to be home. I grew up in this coastal town, just a few miles from the Cooper River, in a world defined by one grocery store, one high school, and Friday nights spent under the blinding stadium lights. Sunday mornings were always spent in this chapel, wearing pressed shirts that smelled of heavy starch and the underlying scent of my father's impatience to get to the country club. My father liked things that made him appear solid and respectable to his neighbors. He worked incredibly hard at his firm, and I would never take that achievement away from him. He was a man who believed in the moral superiority of showing up early and being the last one to leave the office. He believed in the power of a firm handshake and the necessity of a daughter who knew how to smile at exactly the right moments during a dinner party. He believed in Isabella because she was easy for him to categorize and understand. She laughed at all of his jokes, she followed the rules of his house without question, and she stayed close enough to home that he could keep an eye on her. She was marrying Benjamin, a man from a prestigious family, and to my father, that was the ultimate proof that he had succeeded as a parent. I was always the other one, the difficult child, the quiet one, the daughter who asked far too many questions and never seemed to know when it was time to stop pushing against the edges of our life. When I finally told him at the age of 19 that I had decided to enlist in the army instead of going to the local college he had chosen, he had stared at me with an expression of such pure bewilderment it was as if I had announced I was moving to the dark side of the moon. "For what possible reason would you do that?" he had asked me, his voice dripping with disappointment. "You aren't built for that kind of life." I didn't try to argue with him that night, and I didn't try to explain the fire that was burning in my gut. I had already learned that providing him with an explanation was just an open invitation for him to spend an hour telling me exactly why I was wrong. My mother had been standing in the doorway to the kitchen, drying her hands on a faded dish towel, her eyes looking tired but radiating a quiet kind of kindness. Later that same night, she had come into my room and sat on the edge of my bed, her voice a soft whisper in the dark. She had said, "Your father measures a person's worth in a very specific way that unfortunately leaves a lot of good people out. Please, don't ever let his narrow vision make you feel like you need to be small." I had carried those words with me longer and further than almost anything else I owned. The training at the academy and in the field had been grueling, but it was honest in a way my childhood had never been. In the military, you either did the work or you didn't, and the rank on your shoulder didn't care about how much charm you had or who your father was in South Carolina. Respect was something earned one quiet, difficult decision at a time, and I had thrived in that environment. I learned how to keep my voice level even when the world was exploding around me, how to make my movements efficient, and how to make sure that any promise I made was one I intended to keep. Somewhere along the way, people in high places started to listen when I spoke. I never bothered to tell my father about the commendations I received, or the late nights spent over maps, or the missions that never made the evening news because we had done our jobs so well that nothing went wrong. When he would occasionally ask what I did for a living, I kept my answers simple and vague. "I help people," I would say, and he would just nod with a satisfied expression before changing the subject to something he found more interesting. In his version of my life, I was something unimportant and uninspiring, a civil servant doing menial tasks in a uniform he didn't respect. That version of me was easier for him to carry than the truth, so I had allowed him to keep it. The officiant asked the congregation to rise, and I felt the fabric of my dress brush against my legs as I stood. Isabella appeared at the back of the chapel, looking absolutely radiant, her arm looped through our uncle, as he prepared to give her away. She looked beautiful, truly and honestly beautiful, and when she finally caught my eye from the back of the room, she gave me a small, nervous, and incredibly real smile. I smiled back at her, pouring every bit of love I had into that single look. Whatever else was going to happen today, and whatever fallout resulted from the general's salute, I wanted my sister to have this moment unbroken and perfect. As she reached the front of the altar, I felt a slight movement in the pew beside me. The general had turned slightly in his seat, and while he didn't look directly at me again, his presence was unmistakable. It felt like a steady, grounding pressure in the room, a reminder that I wasn't as alone as I had felt when I walked through the door. Men like Arthur Vance didn't fill space by accident, they did it by being exactly where they were supposed to be at exactly the right time. The vows began, and I listened to the ancient words about love, patience, and the daily choice to put someone else before yourself. I really listened this time, and I felt something that had been knotted tight in my chest for years finally start to loosen. This was good for Isabella, and it was right. And still, I could practically feel my father unraveling just a few rows ahead of me. When the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, the entire room seemed to exhale a breath it had been holding since the salute. Applause broke out, the real, joyous kind this time, and Isabella laughed through her tears as Benjamin kissed her with a sense of relief written across every feature of his face. As the guests began to stand and turn toward the exit, the general rose again, but he didn't do it sharply this time. He moved deliberately, stepping into the aisle to face my father. Mr. Walker, the general said, his voice low but carrying that unmistakable tone of command that demanded a response. My father looked up at him, looking startled and out of his depth, like a man who had suddenly been addressed by the wrong name. Yes, my father stammered, that's me. The general extended a hand. Thank you for welcoming my family into your home today. Your daughter has chosen an excellent man in my son, and I believe they will build a fine life together. My father took the general's hand automatically, his grip firm, perhaps a little too firm, as he defaulted to his practiced manners like a drowning man grabbing a life raft. Thank you, General, he said. We are honored. Then the general added the words that I knew would change everything. And your other daughter, she has served this country with a level of distinction that very few will ever achieve. It wasn't an accusation, and it wasn't a bit of praise meant to wound my father's pride. It was simply a statement of objective fact. My father swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. I see, he said, stopping to try again. I suppose I didn't fully realize the extent of her role. The general gave a single, knowing nod. Many people don't, he said, but that doesn't change the truth of what she has done. He released my father's hand and turned back toward the aisle as the guests began to file out toward the reception. I stayed in my seat for a long moment, letting the room empty out around me. I wasn't trying to hide, I was simply choosing my timing. That is another thing the service teaches you, how to move only when it actually matters. When I finally stood up to leave, my father turned around from where he was standing near the altar. Our eyes met across the empty pews, and for the first time in more than a decade, he looked truly uncertain. He didn't look angry, and he didn't look dismissive. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized he had been reading the wrong map for his entire life. And I understood then that whatever conversation came next didn't need to be loud or dramatic. It just needed to be honest. The reception hall at the country club was only a short 5-minute walk from the chapel, but the atmosphere made it feel like I had traveled to a different country. The ceiling was lower and draped in silk, the lights were much warmer and softer, and dozens of round tables filled the massive ballroom. The white cloths were pulled tight over the tables, and the place cards were lined up with the kind of careful optimism that only belongs to people who believe that order can prevent any further surprises. Somewhere near the mahogany bar, a large speaker hummed with static, as if it were unsure whether it was actually supposed to start playing celebratory music yet. I took a seat at a table near the very edge of the room, close enough to see the head table where Isabella would sit, but far enough away that I wouldn't be in the center of the social storm. That had always been my comfortable position in this family, near enough to observe, but never considered necessary for the functioning of the whole. The general was standing near a tall window, speaking quietly with Benjamin. Their heads were close together and their voices were low, but I caught fragments of their conversation as I passed by words like timing, respect, and not today. Benjamin was nodding his head, looking both grateful and completely overwhelmed in equal measure. My father was hovering near the head table, surrounded by a group of relatives, who suddenly seemed much less sure of their footing than they had been an hour ago. They were laughing a little too loudly at things that weren't funny, adjusting their formal jackets every few seconds, and taking frequent sips of water they clearly didn't need. No one in the family mentioned what had happened back at the chapel, but the memory of the salute hung over the entire reception hall like a change in the weather. I focused on the rhythm of my own breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth. I had to remind myself that this wasn't a battlefield and that no life-altering decisions needed to be made in the next 60 seconds. Still, my body had a memory of its own, and it remembered exactly what it felt like to be watched by a room full of people. A young server placed a chilled glass of water in front of me. "Can I get you anything else to drink, ma'am?" she asked, her voice gentle and polite. "No, thank you," I said, offering her a genuine smile. "This is perfect." She looked relieved for some reason and moved on to the next table. Across the room, the general caught my eye and gave me a very small, private nod. It wasn't a command to come over, and it wasn't a summons to talk, it was a symbol of my presence. I returned the gesture and stayed exactly where I was. I didn't need to be physically near him to feel the ripple effect he had already had on the room. People began to settle into their designated seats as the catering staff moved through the room with appetizers. The sound of forks clinking against china filled the air, and the low murmur of conversation returned to the ballroom, cautious and quiet at first, but slowly gaining confidence as the minutes passed. A song started to play over the speakers, something soft and familiar, the kind of mid-tempo tune meant to keep emotions from spilling over into anything messy. My father finally broke away from his group of admirers and began to walk toward my table. He stopped a few feet away, hovering as if there were an invisible, electrified line on the carpet that he wasn't sure he was allowed to cross. He said, his voice sounding different than it had this morning. "I honestly didn't know." I looked up at him, and I really looked at his face for the first time in years. The lines around his eyes seemed much deeper than I remembered, and his hands, which had always been so steady and commanding, were trembling just slightly at his sides. "I didn't hide anything from you, Dad," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "You just never bothered to ask me about my life." His jaw tightened at the truth of it. "That's not a fair thing to say," he countered, though the fire wasn't in his voice. "No," I agreed, "it isn't fair, but it is the truth." He opened his mouth to say something else, closed it, and then tried again. "That man, the general, he didn't have to do that. He didn't have to make a scene in front of everyone." "He didn't make a scene," I said, refusing to let him twist the narrative. "He showed a fellow officer respect. There's a difference." My father glanced around the room, checking to see who might be listening to us. "In front of everyone we know," he whispered. "In front of the truth," I replied. He flinched at that, his shoulders hunching. For a moment, I honestly thought he might raise his voice and fall back on his old, reliable patterns of dismissal, blame, and control. Instead, he looked past me toward the windows where General Vance now stood alone with his hands clasped behind his back. "Who are you to a man like him?" my father asked, his voice filled with a genuine, baffled curiosity. I considered the question for a moment, wondering how much I should reveal. "I am a former subordinate," I said carefully. "I am a colleague, and I am a person whose judgment he trusts." My father let out a slow, long breath that sounded like a tire losing air. "You could have told me you were that important," he said. I met his eyes and didn't blink. "You never wanted to hear it, Dad. You wanted me to be the version of me that fit into your story." The words landed between us, heavy and undeniable. I didn't try to soften them, but I didn't try to sharpen them either. The silence stretched out between us until someone at the front of the room began to tap a spoon against a glass. Isabella stood up at the head table, looking radiant and glowing in the warm light, and she began to thank everyone for coming to share the day with them. She spoke about the importance of love, the value of family, and how grateful she felt to be surrounded by the people who mattered most in her life. Her eyes moved across the room until they found mine, and she smiled with a warmth that felt like a gift. My father followed the direction of her gaze, and I saw something in his expression shift. It wasn't full acceptance yet, and it certainly wasn't an apology, but it was a recognition. It was the kind of look that comes when a story you've been telling yourself for 20 years finally starts to crack under its own weight. Dinner was served with the usual efficiency of a high-end country club. Plates were passed, wine was poured, and the steady rhythm of the reception took over, carrying everyone forward whether they felt ready for it or not. Halfway through the main course, General Vance stood up from his seat. He didn't tap a glass to get everyone's attention, and he didn't raise his voice. He simply stood up, and the entire room went quiet as if responding to a silent signal that no one consciously heard. "I'll be brief," he began, his voice commanding the room with effortless ease. "Today is about and Benjamin, and I wouldn't dream of taking this moment away from them. But I would be remiss if I didn't say one thing before we move on." He paused, his eyes scanning the room, not searching for someone, but simply acknowledging every person there. "True service doesn't always look the way people expect it to look," he continued. "Sometimes service is loud and visible for everyone to see, but often the most important kind of service is neither of those things. It is quiet, it is invisible, but it is always worthy of our highest respect." He turned his body slightly, just enough so that his line of sight included me at my table on the edge of the room. "There are people among us today who have carried weights that we will never truly understand. People who have made decisions that ensured others could come home to their families, who did their work without the need for applause, and then returned to their lives quietly." A profound hush settled over the tables, the sound of silverware stopping entirely. "I only ask that we all take a moment to honor that kind of selfless service when we are lucky enough to see it," the general said, his voice dropping an octave. "Especially when that service belongs to one of our own." He inclined his head toward me once, a final gesture of respect, and then sat back down in his chair. No applause followed his words. It wasn't that kind of moment. My father stared down at his plate, his appetite clearly forgotten. Across from him, a cousin shifted uncomfortably in their seat, and someone at a nearby table cleared their throat. The band began to play again, a soft and airy tune that gave the room permission to start breathing and talking again. I felt that familiar sensation in my chest, not the rush of triumph I might have expected, and not even relief. It was just the feeling of air finally returning to a room that had been vacuum-sealed for years. After dinner was finished, and the guests began to move toward the dance floor, General Vance approached my table. "May I join you for a moment?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair beside me. "Yes, sir," I said automatically, and then I caught myself and gave a small smile. "Of course, Arthur." He smiled back, a small, knowing look in his eyes. "Old habits," he said. "They are the things that keep us alive," I replied. He nodded in agreement, his gaze moving toward the bar. "Your father is struggling with the reality of the situation," he noted. "That isn't exactly a new development for him," I said. "No," the general agreed, "I imagine not, but it may be a necessary struggle for him to go through." I considered that for a moment, looking at my father's slumped back. "I didn't come here today to punish him, Arthur. I really didn't." "I know you didn't," he said gently. "You came because it was the right thing to do for your sister. And that, more than anything else, is why you are the officer that you are." Those words did more to loosen the tension inside me than the salute or the speech ever could have. Across the room, my father was watching us, not with his usual anger or arrogance, but with something that looked much closer to fear. For the very first time in our lives, he wasn't sure where he stood in relation to me, and to be honest, neither was I. The band started to play a song that was slow and familiar, the kind of music meant to invite couples onto the floor without having to force them. People began to stand up, the sound of chairs scraping softly against the wood filling the gaps in the music. Laughter returned to the room in cautious, quiet layers. From a distance, if you weren't looking too closely, the reception probably looked normal again. Weddings have a peculiar way of insisting on a display of joy, even when a hard truth has just finished rearranging the entire room. I stayed in my seat, not because I was afraid of what might happen next, but because I knew better than to try and rush a moment that was still in the process of unfolding. I understood that some truths need physical space to settle into the floorboards before they can be fully processed by the people in the room. The general remained beside me for a while longer, his posture relaxed now, and his hands resting loosely on his knees. Without the formal backdrop of the chapel pews, he looked his age, lines etched deep into his face by weather and decades of heavy responsibility, but he also looked lighter, as if the act of saluting had released a tension he had been carrying for years. "You didn't have to stay here with me," I said quietly, my voice barely carrying over the sound of the band. "This is a family matter, and you have guests to attend to." He shook his head once, a slow and deliberate movement. "No, it is a matter of respect, and in my world respect is always my business." I let that statement sit between us for a moment. Across the room, Benjamin was dancing with Isabella, his hand steady at the small of her back and his smile looking real for the first time all day. He caught my eye briefly over her shoulder and gave me a small, meaningful nod. It wasn't a gesture of gratitude exactly, but an of a shared understanding that didn't need to be vocalized. Whatever he had recognized back in the chapel hadn't faded. If anything, the reality of it seemed to be grounding him. My father lingered near the mahogany bar, an untouched drink held tightly in his hand. He looked entirely out of place now, like a man who had rehearsed for a specific role in a play, and suddenly found himself on the wrong stage with the wrong script. Every few seconds, I could see his gaze flick toward my table and then dart away just as quickly, as if making eye contact would demand something of him that he wasn't yet prepared to give. The general followed my line of sight and sighed. "He built a version of you in his head that he could live with," he said, his voice low. "People often do that when the truth of someone's character challenges their own sense of control." I smiled faintly, though there was no joy in it. That version was much easier for him to manage. "Undoubtedly," the general agreed. A waiter passed by carrying a silver tray of champagne flutes, and the general took two, handing one to me without asking if I wanted it. I accepted it more for the gesture than the actual drink. "You know," he continued, "for years, people in certain circles talked about an officer who rerouted a collapsing operation without waiting for orders while under heavy fire. They said this officer got everyone out of the valley before the air support even arrived." There were no names attached to the story, just rumors. Some thought it was an exaggeration, and some thought it was impossible. I looked down at the tiny bubbles rising in my glass, the memory of that night flashing behind my eyes. Rumors always travel faster than the after-action reports. He said, especially when the facts belong to someone who doesn't feel the need to advertise their own shadow. I remembered that night as clearly as if the dust were still in my lungs, the noise, the static on the radio, and the terrifying moment when I realized that waiting for permission would cost lives I wasn't willing to lose. I hadn't thought of it as bravery at the time, I had thought of it as simple math. Time versus people. Risk versus certainty. I had made a choice, and I had lived with it. "You saved my son," the general said, his voice losing every bit of its formal edge. I looked up, meeting his eyes, and saw a raw sincerity there that made me catch my breath. "Not directly in that valley, perhaps, but the unit you pulled out. They rotated forward 3 months later. Benjamin was a lieutenant with them. If you hadn't made that call, he wouldn't be standing here today dancing with your sister." I hadn't known that. I had pulled out 100 soldiers that night, and to me, they had been a list of call signs and a responsibility. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I wasn't trying to be a ghost, Arthur. I was just trying to do the job. "I know," he said, "and that's exactly why your father is so confused. He doesn't understand a job that doesn't come with a trophy." He stood up then, his movements fluid. "I should go speak with him. I believe he needs to hear a few things from someone he actually respects." I tensed up instinctively. "You don't have to do that." "I want to," he said gently. Not to correct him, but to tell him exactly what he's been standing next to all these years without seeing it. He crossed the ballroom with the unhurried confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove to the world. I watched as conversations faltered, and people stepped aside to let him pass. My father straightened his posture when the general approached, his civilian instincts for hierarchy taking over even in his shock. They spoke quietly near the bar, and while I couldn't hear the words, I didn't need to. I watched my father's face change in stages, confusion, then a desperate kind of denial, and finally something that looked a lot like grief. He shook his head once, as if trying to dislodge a thought that was too heavy for him to carry. When the general finally returned to the head table, my father didn't go back to his friends. He began to walk toward me, his steps slow and his posture careful. He stopped in front of my table, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere near my left shoulder. "I didn't know," he said again, but this time the words sounded different. They weren't defensive, they sounded hollow, like a bell that had been cracked. I stood up so that we were nearly the same height, a physical shift that felt strangely significant in the quiet corner of the room. "You knew exactly what you wanted to know, Dad," I said. "And for a long time, that was enough for both of us." He swallowed hard, his hands twisting together. I truly thought you had chosen something smaller for yourself, something less than what Isabella was doing." I held his gaze, refusing to let him look away this time. "I chose something real. I chose a life where my worth wasn't decided by who saw me at a party." Silence wrapped around us, not hostile anymore, but honest and heavy. The general had stepped back to give us space, understanding that he didn't need to witness this final transition. "I don't need you to fully understand my world, Dad," I said after the silence became too much. "But I do need you to stop pretending that I don't exist unless my existence suits your narrative." My father's shoulders sagged, the rigid rebar of his posture finally giving way to the weight of the day. "I don't even know how to begin to fix this," he admitted, his voice a whisper. "I'm not asking you to fix the past," I said. "I'm just asking you not to break the future again by trying to rewrite it." He nodded once, a quick and painful movement, and it was all he could manage before he turned and walked away. The rest of the reception unfolded like a dream. People danced, children ran through the tables, and the ordinary joy of a wedding returned to the room, rearranged but intact. Later, as the guests began to drift toward the exit, and the Charleston humidity settled over the docks outside, Isabella found me by the coat rack. She leaned her head against my shoulder the way she used to when we were children, and I felt the familiar ache of a sister's love. "I didn't know everything," she whispered. "I know," I said, smoothing her hair. "You weren't supposed to, today was your day." "I'm proud of you," she said, pulling back to look at me with shining eyes. "More than I can say." I drove home that night with the windows down. letting the cool Atlantic air wash over me. The road out of town curved past the old diner and the fields where we used to watch the fireworks, and I felt a tightness in my chest finally dissolve. For years, I had been holding myself smaller than necessary to fit into a story that wasn't written for me. Tonight, that pressure was gone, not because my father had changed, but because I had finally stopped waiting for his permission to stand at my full height. As the city lights faded in my mirror, I realized that some victories aren't won on a battlefield. They are won in the quiet moment you decide that your own truth is the only audience you will ever truly need. The drive back to my aunt's house was a blur of flickering streetlights and the rhythmic humming of tires against the asphalt. Charleston at night has a way of feeling like an ancient, living thing, with the smell of the marsh and the salt air clinging to everything like a heavy, humid blanket. I kept the radio off, preferring the sound of the wind rushing through the cracked window. For the first time in as long as I could remember, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt like a room that had finally been cleared of unnecessary clutter. My mind kept looping back to the image of my father standing by the bar, looking at me as if I were a stranger he was meeting for the very first time. There was a profound, unsettling weight in the realization that it took a four-star general's salute to make my own father recognize the person I had become. It shouldn't have been that way, but as I navigated the winding roads shaded by moss-draped oaks, I felt a strange sense of closure settling over me. I wasn't waiting for him anymore. When I finally reached the small, clapboard guest house on the edge of the property, I sat in the car for a few minutes with the engine idling. I watched a single porch light casting a long, amber shadow across the gravel driveway. The adrenaline from the wedding was finally beginning to ebb away, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that felt like it reached all the way down to my marrow. I turned the key, and the sudden silence of the night felt thick and absolute. Inside, the house smelled of old books and lavender, a scent that had always belonged to Aunt but felt particularly grounding tonight. I kicked off my heels and walked across the hardwood floors, the cool wood feeling good against my tired feet. I didn't turn on any of the overhead lights. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the moonlight filtering through the thin lace curtains. My phone buzzed in my purse, a text from Isabella. "Thank you for being there, truly. Benjamin can't stop talking about you. Sleep well, I love you." I felt a lump form in my throat, a rare flash of raw emotion that I usually kept tucked away behind a disciplined exterior. I didn't reply right away. I just held the phone, the glow of the screen the only light in the room. I thought about the two of us as children, hiding under the dining room table while our father hosted his endless business dinners. Even then, Isabella had been the one to giggle and charm her way into his heart, while I was the one who watched the clocks, waiting for the moment we were allowed to disappear. Sleep came in fitful, shallow waves, punctuated by dreams of dusty valleys and the sound of helicopters that always seemed just out of reach. I woke up before the sun was fully over the horizon, the habit of early morning formations being too deeply ingrained to ignore. The air was cool and crisp as I stepped out onto the porch with a mug of coffee, watching the fog roll off the nearby creek. I spent the next few hours in a quiet, meditative state, packing my bags with a level of precision that made me smile. Every item had its place, every fold was sharp. It was a small, private ritual of order that always helped me prepare for whatever came next. Around 9 o'clock, a car pulled into the driveway. I recognized the low rumble of my father's sedan before I even saw it. He didn't get out right away. He sat in the driver's seat for a long minute, staring at the steering wheel. When he finally stepped out, he looked tired. His suit from the night before had been replaced by a simple polo shirt and slacks, but his shoulders still carried that new, heavy slump I had noticed at the reception. He walked up the porch steps, his movements hesitant, a stark contrast to the commanding presence he had maintained for my entire life. "Morning," he said, his voice sounding scratchy and thin. "Morning, Dad," I replied, gesturing to the chair beside me. "Coffee." He shook his head and leaned against the railing instead, looking out at the trees. "I suppose you're heading back to the base soon." "In a few hours," I said. "I have to be back for a briefing tomorrow morning." He nodded, the silence between us stretching out, but it didn't feel as hostile as it used to. It felt like we were both standing on opposite sides of a canyon, trying to figure out if there was a bridge left to cross. "Arthur Vance, the general, he told me some things last night, about what you've been doing. About what happened a few years ago. I took a slow sip of my coffee, the heat of the mug warming my palms. He didn't have to do that. No, my father agreed, finally turning to look at me. But he seemed to think I needed to hear it. And he was right. I spent a lot of years telling people you were just finding yourself in the army. I told myself that you chose that life because you didn't want the responsibility of the family business. I didn't realize that you were carrying a responsibility that made mine look like child's play. It's not a competition, Dad, I said quietly. I didn't join to prove you wrong. I joined because I wanted to do something that mattered to me. I wanted to be part of something where my name didn't give me a head start. And you succeeded, he said, a note of genuine, painful realization in his voice. The general said you're one of the finest officers he's ever served with. He said you saved his son's life. My own daughter saved the life of the man my other daughter just married, and I had absolutely no idea. I was so busy being disappointed that you weren't following my script that I missed the fact that you were writing a much better one. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw a man who was finally, truly seeing his child. It wasn't the dramatic reconciliation I might have imagined when I was a teenager, and it didn't fix everything that had been broken over the last 10 years, but it was an honest start. I just wanted you to acknowledge that my life was real, Dad, that it wasn't just a hobby or a way to get away from Charleston. I know, he said, his eyes moistening. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry it took this long for me to see it. I don't expect you to forgive me today or even tomorrow, but I want to try, if you'll let me. We can keep it simple for now, I said, offering a small, cautious smile. Maybe we start with you actually asking me how my work is going. He let out a short, surprised laugh and nodded. I can do that, I'd like to do that. We talked for a little while longer, about nothing urgent, just the weather and Isabella's plans for her honeymoon, before he finally stood up to leave. He reached out and squeezed my hand, a gesture that felt awkward and unpracticed but sincere. As his car disappeared down the road, I felt a weight lifting off my chest that I hadn't even realized was there. I wasn't staying for him, and I wasn't leaving because of him. I was simply moving forward. Before I left town, I made one final stop. The cemetery was quiet, the only sound being the rustle of the wind through the palmetto trees. I walked through the familiar rows of headstones until I reached the one I was looking for. Sarah Walker. My mother's grave was always well tended, but I spent a few minutes clearing away some fallen leaves and straightening the small American flag that sat in a bronze holder nearby. I stood there for a long time, the sun warming my back, and thought about the words she had whispered to me on my last night home before enlisting. I did it, Mom, I said softly, the wind carrying my voice away. I was bigger than the room, and I didn't let them make me small. I felt a profound sense of peace then, a feeling of absolute certainty that my mother would have been proud of the woman standing there today. I wasn't just a soldier, and I wasn't just a daughter. I was, and for the first time in my life, that was more than enough. The drive back to the base was long, the miles of highway stretching out ahead of me like a promise. As I crossed the state line, I rolled up the windows and let the humming of the engine fill the space. I thought about the general's salute, the groom's gray face, and my father's slumped shoulders. But mostly I thought about the future. I thought about the briefings, the maps, and the soldiers who relied on my judgment every single day. I thought about the quiet, invisible work that truly built a legacy. When I finally pulled through the gates of the base, the familiar rhythm of military life welcomed me back like an old friend. The sharp salutes from the sentries, the sound of boots on the pavement, and the disciplined energy of the barracks felt right. I was home. That evening, I sat at my small desk in my quarters and pulled out my journal. I wrote down the events of the day, not as a report, but as a reminder to myself. I wrote about the importance of respect, the power of silence, and the necessity of standing at your full height, even when the world is trying to push you down. And then, I closed the book and looked at the medals I had left in my trunk. The things my father had never seen and that the general had recognized instantly. They were just pieces of metal and ribbon, but they represented a truth that no one could ever take away from me. Life continued with its steady, unyielding pace. I returned to my duties, the missions became more complex and the responsibilities grew heavier. But something had fundamentally changed inside me. I didn't feel the need to hide my achievements, and I didn't feel the need to shout them from the rooftops either. I simply lived them. I stayed in touch with Isabella, her letters filled with the joy of her new life, and occasionally, I even received a short, thoughtful note from my father. They weren't perfect, and they didn't always say the right thing, but they were a bridge, and that was enough. Months later, I was promoted to a new rank in a small, private ceremony. General Vance was there, as was Benjamin. My father had even made the trip up, standing in the back of the room and watching with a quiet, focused intensity. When the ceremony was over, he didn't rush forward to brag to the other officers about his daughter. He waited until the room had cleared out, then he walked over and shook my hand firmly. "Congratulations," he said, his voice steady. "I'm proud of you." "Thank you, Dad," I replied. As we walked out into the bright afternoon sun together, I realized that some victories are won in the heat of battle, while others are won in the quiet corners of a room when the truth finally finds its way to the light. I had spent my whole life trying to be seen, and in the end, all I had needed to do was stand straight and wait for the world to catch up. If you have ever felt like the invisible person in your own family, or if you have ever carried a burden that no one else seemed to understand, I want you to know this: your truth matters. You don't need a spotlight to be important, and you don't need anyone's permission to be exactly who you are. Sometimes, the truest kind of honor is the kind you carry in your own heart, even when no one else is looking. And when the time comes to stand at your full height, don't flinch. Just breathe, scan the room, and remember that you are exactly where you are supposed to be. The story of the Walker family didn't end that day in the chapel, and it didn't end with a promotion. It continued in the quiet moments of shared coffee and honest conversations, in the gradual rebuilding of trust, and in the recognition that every person carries a legacy of their own. I was done being the invisible daughter, and I was done letting my father's narrow vision define my worth. I was Walker, soldier, officer, and a woman who had finally found the air to breathe. As the sun sets over the marshlands of South Carolina, and the lights of the city begin to twinkle in the distance, I think about all the stories that are currently being written in silence. I think about the quiet heroes, the difficult daughters, and the men who are finally learning how to listen. And I hope that, when their moment comes, they will find the strength to stand straight and let the truth speak for itself. Because in the end, that is the only kind of legacy that truly lasts. The world is a vast, complicated place, filled with people who will try to measure you by their own narrow yardsticks. They will tell you who you should be, how you should act, and what success looks like. But their measurements don't matter. What matters is the quiet certainty of your own conscience and the knowledge that you have done the work that needed to be done. I looked at the framed photograph of my mother that sat on my nightstand, her smile a constant reminder of the strength she had passed down to me. I thought about the general's salute one last time, not as a moment of triumph, but as a moment of alignment, the moment when the internal truth of my life finally met the external reality of the world. And as I closed my eyes and let the sounds of the bass lull me to sleep, I knew that I was finally whole. The journey back to yourself is never a straight line. It is filled with detours, roadblocks, and moments of profound doubt. But if you keep moving forward, if you refuse to let the world make you small, you will eventually find your way home. And when you do, you will realize that the person you were always meant to be was there all along, just waiting for you to notice. So, to anyone who is still waiting for their father to see them, or for their family to understand their worth, don't wait. Stand at your full height today. Be bigger than the room. And remember that the most important salute you will ever receive is the one you give to yourself in the mirror every single morning. Your story is yours to write, and no one else gets to hold the pen. As the night deepens and the world goes quiet, I am grateful for the journey that brought me here. I am grateful for the hard lessons, the long silences, and even the rejection. Because without those things, I wouldn't be the woman I am today. I wouldn't be standing here, finally, in the light. The silence of the bass at night has a specific quality, a watchful, waiting energy that I have grown to love. It is a reminder that even in the darkness, there are people standing guard, doing the work that keeps the world turning. I am one of those people, and I have never been more proud of that fact. My father finally understands that now, but more importantly, so do I. The future is wide open, a blank map that I am ready to fill with new missions, new challenges, and a new kind of family legacy. A legacy built on honesty, respect, and the courage to be seen for who you truly are. It is a legacy that Isabella will carry into her new marriage, and that I will carry into every room I enter for the rest of my life. The wind chimes on Aunt's porch used to sound like a warning to me, a reminder of the things I couldn't change. But now, when I hear them in my memory, they sound like a celebration of a voice that finally found its strength, and a daughter who finally found her way home. In the end, we're all just trying to find our place in the story. And sometimes, the most important part of that story is the moment you decide to stop being a background character and start being the hero of your own life. It doesn't require a uniform, or a title, or even a salute. It just requires the honesty to say, "This is who I am." And once you say those words, the rest of the world has no choice but to listen. The lights of the chapel have long since been extinguished, and the lilies have faded, but the truth of that day remains. It is etched into the floorboards and whispered in the wind that blows through the oaks. It is a truth that has fundamentally changed the Walker family, and it is a truth that will guide me for as long as I live. I am no longer the girl who asked too many questions. I am the woman who knows the answers. And as I step out into the new day, ready to face whatever comes my way, I know that I will never flinch again. Because I am bigger than the room. And I am finally, truly, standing in my own light. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever felt like you had to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's expectations, or if you have ever found strength in the quietest moments of your life, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know which part of this journey stayed with you the most. We all have stories to tell, and by sharing them, we help each other find the courage to stand a little taller. Until next time, keep writing your own script. And remember, the most powerful thing you can ever be is yourself. Your story matters, and it is worth telling, even if you have to start with a whisper. Because eventually, if you stay true to your path, that whisper will become a voice that the whole world will have to acknowledge. Stand straight, breathe deep, and don't ever let anyone decide your worth but you. The sun is rising over the base now, casting a golden light over the parade grounds. It is a new day, a new mission, and a new opportunity to be the person my mother knew I could be. I am ready. I am, and I am finally free. The world is waiting for your story. Don't keep it waiting any longer. Be bigger than the room. And when the time comes, don't be afraid to take your place in the light. Thank you for walking this road with me, for listening to the truth of a daughter who finally found her name, and for remembering that honor isn't something that's given, it's something you carry within yourself every single day. May you all find the strength to stand at your full height and the courage to let the world see you for who you truly are. Because that is where the real victory lies. The silence of the night has finally given way to the noise of the day, and I am grateful for every sound. Each one is a reminder that I am alive, that I am serving, and that I am finally, truly myself. God bless and keep moving forward. The path is yours to walk and the story is yours to tell. Don't flinch, just breathe and stand straight. The end of the story is just the beginning of everything else. And for Walker, everything else is going to be magnificent. The moss-covered oaks of Charleston are far behind me now, but their strength is still with me. The salt air of the coast has been replaced by the dry heat of the base, but the clarity I found there hasn't faded. I am a different woman than the one who walked into that chapel, and I am better for it. I look at the flag waving in the breeze outside my window, a constant symbol of the duty I have chosen. It is a duty that has given me everything, and that has finally allowed me to give something back to my family: the truth. I am done waiting for permission. I am done being the invisible daughter. I am, and this is my story. The road ahead is long, but I am ready. I have my boots, I have my mission, and I have the quiet certainty of my own heart. And that is all I will ever need. May you all find your own version of the General's salute, not for the applause, but for the recognition of your own soul. And when you do, don't forget to smile, because you've earned it. The final words of this story are not a conclusion, but a promise. A promise to stay true, to stay strong, and to never let the world decide who I am. The sun is high in the sky now, and the day is in full swing. I have work to do, and for the first time in my life, I can't wait to get started. Stand straight, you've got this. And so, as the final chapter closes, the real story begins. A story of a woman who finally stood at her full height and realized that the view from the top was even better than she had imagined. Thank you for being part of this journey, for listening, for understanding, and for remembering that every story matters. Now go out and write your own, And don't be afraid to make it a masterpiece.